Hey, welcome to Woodwork for Humans, the series where we make a lot with very little. Like for instance, so far, we've made a rustic bench and a woodworking mallet with very few tools, like almost no tools at all. But there is one tool that I've been using that maybe has sort of been cheating. My bench. A bench like this is an enormous asset when you're doing woodworking. Mine has big, thick timbers for the legs and a heavy, engineered wood top that I can bolt the vise to. And speaking of vices, a cast iron, quick-release vise like this one is one of the most useful and efficient things a woodworker can own. But getting one is no joke. New ones are typically either crappy or very expensive, and even a vintage one like this one can be difficult to get and pricey. I spent months hunting this vise down. It was in very poor condition and needed an extensive restoration. But even with all of that, I still paid $50 for it, and actually getting my hands on it required a lengthy exchange over emails, and then I drove over an hour and picked it up from the parking lot of a grocery store in Fresno, California. Seriously, I've been involved in drug deals that were less sketchy than buying this thing. This is not my first bench. I built this after I had already been woodworking for a few years. My first bench was sort of a heavy work table. It had a metal bottom and a hardwood top, and I inherited it when a local business went under. And that table and the progression from that to this demonstrates the central problem that cash-strapped woodworkers have where benches are concerned. Of course, you want to build a bench like this, but in order to build it, you need a certain set of skills. But to develop those skills, you need some sort of bench to start with. But if you want to build your bench, you need basic skills. It's like a Zen riddle. So for our inexpensive, ultra-basic woodworking, we're going to need an ultra-basic bench. Luckily, this bench exists, and it's actually been around for thousands of years. It's usually called a low Roman workbench. And the Romans probably invented it, but it's been all over the world since then. Central and South America, China, Eastern Europe, everywhere. And the bench is still in use all over the world. This bench is small and lightweight. It's usually about knee height and it's 6 or 7 feet long. It has a ton of different work holding options and it doesn't require a vise, although you can add one later and it's not that big of a project. Basically, it's a bench that anyone can build pretty quickly and easily and get woodworking. How did I learn about it? Well, I read this book. It's called Ingenious Mechanics by Chris Schwarz, and it's a whole history and description of low Roman woodworking benches. He traces them all the way through history, shows a bunch of different paintings where they come up, does all kinds of crazy historical research to figure out where they came from. He even went to Italy to look at some original examples. And then he builds a bunch of the benches and gives very clear instructions on how to do it. They're instructions that really anybody can follow. So we're going to build a bench out of this book, but make a couple of tweaks to make it cheaper and friendlier to our super basic approach. Most of Chris's benches he builds out of big slabs of hardwood. These are difficult to find and kind of pricey for the DIY woodworker, so we're going to make ours out of construction lumber instead. Also, for attaching the legs into the body, he uses either square, angled mortises, or cone-shaped mortises that require special tools. And we're going to simplify that too. We're just going to use the basic round mortise and tenon that we used in our rustic bench build. It's easy to cut and drill, and then we can just tighten it with a hardwood wedge. When we take the basic designs from this and combine it with a friendlier, cheaper approach, we're going to have a fantastic bench that's going to allow us to build really almost anything. And the first thing we're going to need to do is get some wood. So we're going to make this bench out of construction-grade 2x4s. I recommend you get something relatively high quality, so if you can get like southern yellow pine or cypress, those would be good choices. It needs to be kiln dried. What I have here in northern Ohio is Douglas fir. It's another good choice. It's got a really good strength to weight ratio. The one thing I recommend that you don't get is the big box stores sell this stuff they call whitewood, which is some mystery conifer that they import from Asia. And that stuff gives a whole new meaning to the term softwood. It is like mozzarella cheese. And it's not really going to do for a project like this. Spend a couple more bucks and buy whatever the premium construction lumber around you is. And then when you're at the store, take your time and pick out your pieces really carefully. I have like 8 or 9 2x4s here. I genuinely went through 30 or 40 of them and I checked to make sure they were the straightest, most defect-free boards I could find. It took a little while, but nobody at Home Depot is going to care so long as you stack your rejects back up afterwards. I recommend you buy an odd number of 2x4s. My reasons for that will make more sense as we're building. As far as the width goes, if you get 7 2x4s, you'll end up with an 11-inch wide bench. And believe it or not, 11 inches is great for average or slightly smaller people. If you get 9 2x4s, then you'll have about 14 inches, give or take. And I'm a pretty big, tall guy, so I want my bench to be a little bit larger. It's going to be more comfortable for me. And what I'm doing right now is I've just got my 2x4s lined up, and I'm just looking for places where there are bows or any problems that are going to keep my bench from wanting to glue together gracefully. I'm going to try and move bowed wood out and just get the neatest, cleanest glue lines that I can possibly get. And that is about good. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I've got 9, which is perfect. Now I've got my 2x4 set up in a way that's minimizing gaps, and I've got a couple of clamps on them very, very lightly. During the glue up, it's okay if the clamps are pulling some of the gaps together, but if you're relying on the clamps to crush the 2x4s together, you're going to introduce twisting and bowing. It's going to make it very difficult for you to get a flat top. So the clamps should only be applying very light pressure, really nothing more than you can do with your hands. Any more gaps that you have besides that, you're going to have to address before the glue up. What I'm going to do now is take the mallet that I made in a previous video and just make sure everything is flat and sitting as square on the table as it can be. I pretty much like everything I see, so I'm going to draw a big cabinet maker's triangle. This is going to allow me to come back and reassemble the boards in this shape. And now I'm going to start hunting for gaps between the boards and seeing where those gaps are from. So looking at the top, I have a little bit of a gap here, and a little bit of a gap here, and a big gap right here. So it's all along this board here. And since I have gaps here, here, and here, that tells me this board is bowed towards me a little bit. And I'm going to identify that bow by just striking a couple of lines around where I think it is, and then drawing an arrow towards it. That's going to give me a clear indication of where I'm going to need to plane this board. It's going to make it easier in the next step. Now I'll go along and identify any other bumps or humps that are keeping this thing from coming together easily, and then we'll take them out. So, the good news is you don't need a bench to build a bench. If you don't have a table or someplace heavy to work, it's no problem. Grab a couple of milk crates or a couple of 5-gallon buckets, really anything you have, and just set them about 6 feet apart, and that'll give you a platform that you can work on. If you don't have a table or a flat surface, just find a flat piece of ground. I'm working on the floor in my basement. It's flat enough. It's going to get the job done. Throw your piece of material up on top of your milk crates, and then to immobilize it, you can just butt the end up against something. Could be a fence post, a tree. I'm using the post from my stairwell. And then for added security, you can just sit on it, and that'll work really well. And you want to move along the board and just plane off all the stuff that you've noticed. So I took a high spot off right here, and there's a high spot up there. I'm not going to sit in the middle of the board because I'm heavy. So I'm going to pull this milk crate a little bit closer. That way, my weight is not going to bow the board and mess it up, and I'm going to go up here and plane it down. Then, I'll take it out, have a look at it, and see if that edge looks straight. And it does, so I'm pretty happy with this. Oh, and here's an interesting thing that happened. While I was using this plane and taking the big cuts off the 2x4s, I noticed that I couldn't get the iron to stay in place. When I tried to take a big heavy cut, it always kept retracting back into the body. I took a look at the plane and I figured out that the problem is there's not enough friction between the blade and those little contact points that are cast into the body. You can go back and check out the video where I restored this. It'll explain a lot more about that. But I figured out another trick with this plane today, which is that I just sanded all the paint off of those little contact points, and then I just glued a little square of wood veneer in over that. And so now, instead of this slick painted metal that the blade just slides across, there's wood in there, which has a lot more friction, and then that essentially makes the frog a little bit thicker, and it makes the mouth of the plane tighter. I honestly can't believe I didn't think of this before, because now the plane holds a much deeper setting, the iron stays in place better, and the mouth is smaller, so it's going to work better as a smoothing plane. I wish it had been in the original video. But anyway, if you're using this plane and you want to make that adjustment, it's really easy. It only takes a few minutes. And then you can just plane all those high spots off your 2x4s and be ready for the glue up. My lumber was actually pretty good, and I picked it carefully, so I only had to do a little bit of planing to get things lined up and get a nice tight glue joint. You might have to do a little bit, or maybe even none at all. And now I'm ready to glue the whole thing up. The first thing I'm going to do is cross-cut all my pieces to length. These are 8-foot 2x4s, and I only want 7 feet, about 85 inches. So I'm going to cut off all the parts that I don't need. For that, I'm going to use this cheap DeWalt disposable saw. I did a whole review on it, and that video also came out this week, so check that out. It'll tell you all about what's good and bad about this saw and how to use it most efficiently. I have 9 pieces of 2x4 here, and that's a lot of pieces to clamp up all at once, especially if you've never done a big glue up like this before. So if this is your first time, or even if it isn't, I really recommend doing this in 2 stages. It won't take you much longer, and it'll give you an opportunity to adjust things if something goes wrong. So I'm going to take 4 of my 2x4s and start with them. I'm going to lay them down with the glue surfaces up, spread a nice even layer of plain old Titebond yellow wood glue, nothing fancy. I'm going to assemble them using the triangle I drew before as my reference point to make sure they're in the correct order and orientation. And then I'll clamp them up with medium pressure. I'm also going to use the offcuts that I just made from cross-cutting as clamping cauls. They spread out the force of the clamping, and instead of having this tiny little contact point, I'm going to have a much bigger contact point along the joint, and that's going to keep the 2x4s at the end from ending up in sort of a wavy shape. It just evens things out really nicely. Now you can use pretty much any clamps you want for this. I have these inexpensive bar clamps. They're cheap and you can find them all over the place. You can use anything. Even Harbor Freight aluminum clamps are totally fine. One thing that's good about these is that they're deep, so I can reach into the midway point of the 2x4 and I can just put all of my clamps along the top, make sure they're centered top to bottom, and cinch them down tight. You might have a different style of clamp, like this one. This is an excellent clamp, but the jaws are very short by comparison. They can't fit all the way in. That's no problem. If you're using a clamp like this, just put 2 or 3 of them on the top of your glue up, then flip it over and put 2 more on the bottom of the glue up, and alternate them, top and bottom. That way it's going to even out the pressure and you're still going to get a nice straight glue up, no matter which clamps you use. So I'm about halfway through my glue up. I've got the smaller half of my bench top with 4 2x4s all set and curing over on the side of the shop. This is the larger side. It's got 5 2x4s in it. Now the reason that I want an uneven number of boards in my bench top is that I'm going to run a lot of different work holding stuff right down the middle of the bench. So it's really handy to have a full board in the middle instead of a glue line. It's going to make things easier and more stable to drill into or to mortise into. And this is the board that's going to be the middle of the bench. And at some point on either end, I'm going to want a square mortise so that I can drop different work holding things into the bench really easily. Now, I could cut that mortise after the whole bench is put together, but that's kind of a pain, especially in softwood, and there's an easier way to do it while we're doing the glue up. I've taken this piece, it's going to go in the middle, and I've just cut right down here, and then I'm going to open that up a little bit and glue it up like this. I'll use another 2x4 right here as a spacer to make sure I get the size exactly what I want. And when I bring in the other half of the bench and glue it together, I'm going to have a really perfect square mortise right here. And I'll be able to drop all sorts of stuff right into that hole really easily. In just a few minutes, this side of the bench will be glued up. I'll give it a little time to cure, and then I'll join the 2 halves together and let that cure overnight. Once you've got your top assembled, you can start using it as a low bench right away. Just throw it on top of your milk crates, and you have an excellent work surface for ripping and cross-cutting. You can take a little scrap of wood and pound it into the mortise we left and use that as a planing stop. And you can clamp a piece of wood to the side and use the hatchet to pare tenons. And all these operations are pretty smooth and easy, and the bench is a solid surface to work on. Of course, this brings us to the question of legs, and that's a little bit of a tricky one. If you have some hardwood scraps laying around, maybe some nice white oak, I strongly suggest you use that. Me, I'm going to use some of the Doug fir that came with my 2x4s because I want to keep the cost of the bench under $30 and because I'm not sure what my viewers have sitting around. I know you're going to have some of this because we just use it to construct the bench, so this is what we're going to go with. I covered the process of making round, wedged mortise and tenons in my 3-tool bench build that I did a couple weeks ago, so you can check that video out to get all the details on how to cut and carve that joint. But for this one, since I'm a little bit concerned about strength, I'm going to try and give myself a couple of advantages. The biggest thing I'm going to do is drill a larger mortise and make wider tenons so that I have greater strength where the leg joins to the bench. Now, my auger sets top out at 1 inch, but I have spade bits that are 1 1/4 inches, and I'll take that extra 1/4 inch. I think it's going to help. Instead of using a quarter to lay out my mortises, I found a fender washer that's 1 1/4 inches across. I'm sure you have something like that, or you could use a cheap compass. Anything that's 1 1/4 inches will get the job done. I'm also going to do the minimum shaping to the legs and leave as much material as possible. I'll just plane them until they're square and then knock off the corners so they're sort of roughly octagonal, but make them as thick and heavy as I can with the stock that I've got on hand. Your finished bench is going to have legs that angle out in 2 directions. That way the tops of the legs are going to be in towards the middle, and the edges and ends of your bench will be clear for clamping or work holding. The bottoms of your legs are going to be nice and far out and give you a wide, stable platform to work on. There are a lot of names for these angles, like rake and splay, but they're not really important. All you need to know is that the legs are angled in this direction, 32 degrees, and from the top of the leg to the bottom is kicked out 15 degrees. We're going to lay that stuff out right now. It's not going to be difficult. The first thing you're going to do is draw a baseline in from either end of the bench. In his book, Chris recommends 5 3/8 inches as your baseline, but if I did that, my legs would be in roughly the same place as my mortise, and that would make my bench top very weak. So instead, I just went in 9 inches. I took that measurement and then struck a perpendicular line all the way across the bench. That's my baseline. Then I went in 3.5 inches from either side of the bench and struck a point, and those are the exact locations of my legs. Then I used an inexpensive protractor, and I used it to strike a line 32 degrees off my baseline. Finally, I reset the protractor for 15 degrees, and I used that to set up a little bevel gauge. I angled my bevel gauge towards my 32-degree line and taped it down so it wouldn't move around. If you don't have a bevel gauge, you can just use a scrap of cardboard on a little block of wood, like we did in our previous project. With your 2 angles marked out, you have all the guidelines you need to drill the holes and get a nice, consistent angle. Drilling the holes for your legs is going to be a little bit time-consuming, but it's not very difficult. You can use the spade bit in either a brazen bit or an electric drill. And no matter which way you use it, you're going to have to start your hole straight up and down to get the bit cutting, and then angle it to be in line with your 2 layout lines. Having the bench down low is actually very helpful if you're drilling the hole with a brace and bit, because you can get a lot of body weight over the brace and really drive it into the hole. If you're using an electric drill, I recommend running the drill at full speed, but feeding it into the wood very slowly. You're drilling a big hole and it requires a lot of torque. Once you've laid out and bored your leg holes, double check your tenons with a piece of scrap to make sure they're actually going to fit in your mortises. Then take each leg and chop a shallow cone shape from the thick part of the leg down to the tenon. You should have a smooth transition from where the leg is thickest down to where it's narrowest. That cone shape that you're cutting is going to help wedge the leg tighter and tighter into its mortise as weight is applied to the bench over time. That way the legs will only get tighter as the bench is used, not looser. You're also going to need to slit your tenons with your fine saw. Cut the slits all the way down to the top of that cone shape, and make sure that they run perpendicular to the long part of your bench, not parallel. That way, when you drive the wedges in, you have very little chance of splitting the top. Get the bench upside down on your milk crates, put the legs in their mortises, and drive them home with a mallet. Don't be afraid to hit them pretty hard. You want them as well seated as they can be. Once your legs are installed, flip the bench over, put glue on the wedges, and pound the wedges into the slits in the tenons. Because I'm using a very hard wood for the wedges, and I've got a very soft wood for my legs, I'm able to knock them all the way in. The legs are compressed a lot, and I have a very, very strong joint. Once everything is dry, you can trim off the waste with a flush cut saw. Once the glue on your legs is dry, you're going to need to level the bench and cut the legs to the correct length. Assuming the bench sits more or less level when you flip it over, it'll be easy to dial the legs in by taking a regular pencil and planing it in half, and then gluing it flat side down to a little block of wood. Put the bench on something flat like a tabletop or a flat piece of floor, and then trace around the bottoms of the legs with your pencil and wood jig. Cut the legs at the line that you've made, and you should have a bench that's flat and level and doesn't rock. So here is the completed $30 workbench. Are you a little skeptical? I don't blame you. It's pretty weird looking, but it's also not done. In the weeks ahead, we're going to plane and level the top of this bench and do a bunch of things to add work holding options to it. And that's going to make it function much more like a bench that you're already familiar with. But I have to admit, this bench kind of works great the way it is. That simple stop that we put into our square mortise works great for planing, chopping, trimming, and even doing some saw work. This is also a fantastic saw bench, as is. You can rip and cross-cut in a bunch of different positions, and you have a rock-solid platform. Because it's low, you have tons of leverage, and cuts go by pretty quickly. Obviously, this bench is small. It's not super lightweight, but you can probably move it around by yourself. And you can specifically design your bench so that it is light enough for you to move. You can carry it anywhere you want to. You can work outside. In my shop, for instance, I really don't have space for another bench. I don't have anywhere to put this thing. So when I'm not using it, I'm just going to tip it up against the wall, and it's going to be perfectly out of the way, not really take up any space. The best thing about this bench is that you get to sit down while you're working. While other benches rely on weight or have to be bolted to the ground or to the wall to work, in this bench, you are the weight. And so, with a minimum amount of materials and effort, you make a bench that's solid and sturdy, and is going to help you do a lot of good work. As usual, I've got a free tip sheet that explains all the details, and you can grab that at rexkruger.com/articles. And there's a whole playlist of videos in the Woodwork for Humans series, so check that out in the description. Before I go, thanks so much to all of my patrons on Patreon, whose support makes all of these videos possible. If you're interested in contributing to simple, straightforward woodworking ideas, go over to patreon.com/rexkruger and consider throwing in a couple bucks. I appreciate it more than I can say. Thanks for watching.